The wind had a name in this part of the Arizona Territory. The people of Dry Needle called it the Dust Devil's Breath, and in the long, rainless summer of 1879, it was a constant thief. It stole moisture from the soil, color from the sky, and words from a man's mouth before they could fully form. It whipped the red dust off the high plains until the whole world seemed to bleed a fine, gritty powder that settled in the lines of your face and the folds of your clothes. The town itself, a handful of sun-bleached wooden buildings, clung to the cracked banks of a seasonal creek like a stubborn burr on a coyote's hide. From a ridge overlooking the town, Ashki Nizyani watched the iron horse hiss to a stop, its black smoke a foul stain against a pale sky. He had followed its tracks for 2 days, a path of steel that scarred the land his people had walked for generations. He was a quiet man in his early 20s, with the stillness of the mesas in his posture and the weight of a promise in his eyes. The wind tugged at the dark blue neckerchief tied around his throat, a band of cloth woven by his grandmother, a reminder of a life he was bound to protect. His immediate purpose was Simple the Creek. The two that fed their small farms and watered their precious horses was running low. Whispers had come on the wind of the railroad company's plans, whispers as dry and unsettling as the dust. His greater purpose was a picture in his mind, a sturdy hogan for his sister, a place where the scent of her herbs and remedies could fill the air, safe and permanent. The iron horse had brought men and materials. He had seen the stacks of raw timber and iron fittings unloaded. They were not the things used to lay more track. They were the bones of something else, something that would choke the water. He shifted his weight, his moccasins silent on the rock. Patience was a weapon, and he knew how to use it. He would go into the town, listen and learn. Inside the Dry Needle Railroad station, the telegraph key chattered like an agitated insect. Nora Boone barely noticed the sound anymore. It was simply the rhythm of her life. A widow before she was truly a wife. She had come west from Pennsylvania, seeking not a new husband, but a piece of the sky that belonged only to her. What she found was a sky so vast it was intimidating, and a freedom that came with a heavy price tag of dust, loneliness, and the constant, simmering tension of the frontier. She was smart, with a mind as quick as the electric current that hummed through her fingers. Her fingers danced over the brass key, translating the coded clicks into the formal language of railroad business. But today, a different kind of message had come through. A private dispatch for Captain Silas Merritt, head of security for the Elkhorn Water and Railroad Company. It was encrypted, but the repeating patterns were a puzzle she could not resist. While waiting for a confirmation from the next station, she had scribbled the letters onto a scrap of paper, her mind working through the cipher, just as she felt the lock of the code begin to turn. The station door flew open, letting in a swirl of red dust and the frantic energy of a man named Peters, who ran the general store. "They've been robbed," he shouted, his voice cracking. "The whole Elkhorn wagon train, up near Serpent's Tooth Canyon. The drivers say it was Navajo." The station fell silent, the telegraphs clicking suddenly loud and ominous. Nora's stomach tightened. She had seen the Navajo who came to trade. They were quiet, proud people, their faces etched with a dignity that the hard land could not erase. They were horsemen and farmers, not bandits. A shadow fell over her desk. Captain Silas Merritt stood there, a man whose polished boots and crisp uniform seemed to defy the dust that coated everyone else. He was handsome in a severe, military way, a former cavalry officer who now commanded Elkhorn's private army. He offered a smile that never reached his cold, gray eyes. "Just the usual trouble. Miss Boone," he said, his voice smooth as oiled steel. "A bit of unrest from the locals. Nothing a firm hand cannot solve." He glanced at the telegraph. "Any important dispatches for me?" Nora's hand instinctively covered the scrap of paper where she'd been working on his coded message. "Just the regular freight manifests. Captain, nothing out of the ordinary." Merritt's eyes lingered on her hand for a moment too long. "Good. The Elkhorn Company values efficiency and discretion. An employee who understands that, who sees and hears only what is necessary for her duties, will find her position here very secure. The threat was as clear as if he had drawn a weapon. He tipped his hat and walked out, leaving the air feeling colder than before. Her hands trembled slightly as she uncovered the paper. His visit had given her the last piece of the cipher. Her pencil flew, substituting letters until the words swam into focus. Blockade, Verde Creek Fork. Begin construction 3 days. Await Jack's confirmation. Verde Creek. That was the name on the maps for the stream that gave the town and the Navajo farms their very life. And Jack, that could only mean Canyon Jack, the leader of a band of outlaws who were more ghosts than men, blamed for every crime that could not be pinned on anyone else. The staged robbery, the coded message, the illegal dam. It was a 3-headed snake, and she was standing right in its path. The truth felt like a hot, heavy stone in her gut. Justice was a fine word in the parlors of the East, but out here, it was a fragile thing, easily crushed. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple, the town was simmering with fear and anger. Men gathered in the saloon, their voices loud and their blame aimed squarely at the Navajo. Merritt's men, the so-called security team, fanned the flames, buying drinks and telling stories of past troubles. Nora locked the station door, the weight of the day pressing down on her. She pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders and started the short walk to the boarding house run by the widow Ruth Caldwell. She chose the back alley, wanting to avoid the hostile stares and muttered comments on the main street. The air in the alley was still and thick with the smell of dust and stale beer. 2 men stepped out from the shadows of the blacksmith's workshop, blocking her path. She recognized them as 2 of Merritt's guards, their face flushed with drink. "Well now, look what we have here," one of them slurred, a gap-toothed grin on his face. "The pretty little telegraph girl. Heard you got a message for the captain today?" "I have nothing for you," Nora said, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. She tried to step around them, but the other man moved to block her again. "The captain, he don't like people who read other people's mail," the second man said, taking a step closer. "He told us to make sure you understood that, to make sure you forget anything you might have seen." "I understand perfectly," Nora said, backing away. "Now, if you will excuse me." The first man reached for her arm. "We ain't done talking," a voice, low and calm, cut through the tension. "She said she is done." The men turned. Ashki stood at the mouth of the alley, a silhouette against the fading light. He had moved with no sound, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows. He was not a large man, but he held a stillness that was more intimidating than size. The gap-toothed man laughed. "Look here, one of them finally got brave enough to come into town. You lost, boy." Ashki did not answer. His eyes were on Nora, a quick, assessing glance. Then they moved back to the 2 men. He took one slow step forward. "This ain't your concern," the second man growled, letting go of Nora to face the newcomer. He drew himself up, trying to use his bulk to intimidate. What happened next was a blur of quiet, efficient motion. The bulky man lunged, and Ashki sidestepped, his hands shooting out to grip the man's collar and wrist. He used the man's own momentum, turning him and sending him stumbling hard into a stack of empty barrels. The man went down with a crash and a grunt. The gap-toothed one, momentarily stunned, fumbled for the pistol at his hip before his fingers could close around the handle. Ashki was on him. He did not throw a punch. He simply moved inside the man's reach, his hand striking the man's wrist, sending a jolt of pain up his arm that made him cry out. The desire for a fight vanished from his face, replaced by fear. He scrambled backward, pulling his companion to his feet. They cast one last venomous look at Nora and Ashki before disappearing into the growing darkness. Silence returned to the alley, broken only by the sighing of the wind. Nora stood with her back pressed against the rough wood of the building, her breathing ragged. Ashki stood a few feet away, watching her, his expression unreadable. The blue neckerchief at his throat was the only spot of deep color in the dusty twilight. "Thank you," she finally managed to say, her voice thin. He gave a slight nod. "They work for the man from the railroad." It was a statement, not a question. "Captain Merritt?" "Yes." He looked down the alley toward the main street, where the sounds of the saloon were growing louder. He turned his gaze back to her. His eyes were dark and searching, and for the first time, Nora felt he was truly seeing her. Not just as a white woman or a part of the town that encroached on his land, but as a person. "The wind here dries up words." "Miss," he said, his voice a low rumble, "you should choose them carefully." Nora straightened up, a spark of her usual fortitude returning. "And you seem to be a man who does not waste them." A flicker of something, perhaps surprise or even amusement, crossed his face. "Words are heavy. They should mean something." He paused. "The materials that came on the train, the robbery, the water, they are all connected." Nora's breath caught. He knew, or he suspected. Here in the dust of a back alley stood the only other person who seemed to see the pieces of the same ugly puzzle. A Navajo warrior and an Eastern telegraph operator. An unlikely pair. An impossible alliance. But the fear Merritt had instilled in her was now warring with a desperate need for an ally. "My name is Nora Boone," she said, extending a hand, then letting it drop. Unsure of the custom. "I am Ashki," he replied. He did not offer his hand, but he held her gaze. "The Iron Horse brings trouble, and you are in the middle of it." "I know," she said, the words barely a whisper. "They plan to build a dam on the creek." His jaw tightened, the only sign of the anger that must be simmering beneath his calm exterior. He looked up at the first stars pricking the velvet dark of the sky. He had come to town for information, and he had found it in the most unexpected way. She was afraid. Yet she had not run. She had a fire in her, a stubbornness he recognized. "We need to talk," he said, his voice decisive. "Not here. This town has too many eyes and ears." A bond was forming, fragile and unnamed, forged in a moment of shared danger. It was not built on trust. Not yet. It was built on the shaky ground of a common enemy. As the red dust of the long day settled into the deep shadows of night, Nora Boone knew her life in Dry Needle had irrevocably changed. She was no longer just a clerk recording the business of the West. She had become part of its story, a story of justice and greed, of survival and the lifeblood of the land itself, the precious, dwindling water. Ruth Caldwell's boarding house was an island of lamplight in the dark town. Ruth herself, a woman whose face was a roadmap of past sorrows and present humor, opened the door before they reached it. She took in Nora's pale face and the quiet Navajo man behind her with one sweeping, intelligent glance. She did not ask questions. She simply stepped aside. "The coffee is still warm," she said, her voice a low, comforting rasp. "And the wind is telling lies tonight. Best to be indoors where you can hear the truth." Inside, the main room was clean and smelled of baking bread and wood smoke. Ruth steered them to a small table in the corner, away from the windows. Ashki remained standing by the door for a long moment, his eyes scanning the room, his body poised, before he seemed to deem it safe and moved to the table. He did not sit. "They plan to choke the Verde Creek," Nora said, her voice barely above a whisper. The words tumbling out now that she was in a safe place. She explained the coded telegram, the staged robbery, and Captain Merritt's veiled threats. Ruth listened, her hands busy pouring coffee into thick ceramic mugs. She set one in front of Nora and pushed another toward the empty chair opposite her. "And you," she said, looking at Ashki. "You are the reason my guest was late for supper." "He saved me," Nora said quickly. "From two of Merritt's men in the alley?" Ashki finally sat. the movement fluid and deliberate. He ignored the coffee. The tracks at the canyon were wrong, he said, his gaze fixed on Nora. The story of the robbery is a lie. I will go there at first light, and to the place where they keep the lumber. I need proof, Nora said, thinking aloud. Something more than a coded message only I can read. A document, a shipping order, something with a name on it. The Elkhorn Water and Railroad Company, Ruth said, sitting down with them, her expression grim. They have long arms and deep pockets. You are kicking a hornet's nest, both of you. The water is life, Ashki said simply, as if that explained everything, and to him, it did. Before the sun had risen high enough to burn the chill from the air, Ashki was moving through the gray dawn near the railroad supply yard. He moved like a ghost, his steps making no sound on the hard-packed earth. Near the neatly stacked piles of timber and iron fittings, he found what he was looking for. The ground was churned up, but the story it told was clear to his trained eyes. The hoof prints were from shod horses, but they were too orderly, not the frantic, scattered tracks of a panicked wagon team, and among them were the prints of men's boots. He knelt, examining a clear impression in the dust, a standard-issue army sole, worn at the heel, not the mismatched, worn-out boots of common outlaws. He found another sign near a discarded leather strap. The maker's mark on the leather was not from a local saddler. It was a crisp, factory stamp, the kind used on new military equipment. It had been stamped after the leather was wet. A quick job. Local raiders used gear until it fell apart. They did not have access to new supplies. This was not a robbery. It was a performance. As he was about to leave, a small figure darted out from behind a stack of crates. It was Mateo, a young boy with eyes as dark and bright as obsidian, who scraped a living by collecting scrap metal along the tracks. The boy clutched a few bent railroad spikes. He saw Ashki and froze, like a quail sensing a hawk. Ashki simply gave him a slow nod. The boy, after a moment's hesitation, nodded back before scurrying away. Ashki knew the boy saw many things the adults in Dry Needle were too busy to notice. Back at the station, Nora's nerves were stretched thin. Every click of the telegraph sounded like a footstep behind her. Around mid-morning, Deputy Tom Harlan came in, ostensibly to check the mail schedule. He was a decent man with a kind face and a perpetual look of worry, a man who seemed too gentle for the badge he wore. He lingered at the counter, his gaze shifting nervously toward the door. Heard there was some trouble last night, he mumbled, not meeting her eyes. The whole town has heard. Tom, Nora replied carefully. Merritt is calling a town meeting at noon. He's got some kind of permit from the territorial office. He shuffled a stack of papers in his hands, his fingers clumsy. Says it's all legal. People are scared of Canyon Jack's gang. They'll believe whatever Merritt tells them. He sighed, a sound of deep frustration. This job, it ain't what I thought it would be. He turned to leave, and as he did, a single sheet of paper slipped from his stack and slid under the counter's grate. Landing on Nora's side, he did not seem to notice. He gave her a last, unhappy look and walked out. Nora waited until the door closed before she snatched the paper. It was a copy of the freight manifest for the recent supply shipment. At the top, in bold letters, was the consignee's name, Elkhorn Water Company. And at the bottom was a list of materials: timber beams, iron braces, blasting powder, enough to build a formidable dam. Tom Harlan had just handed her the first piece of solid evidence. The town meeting was a tense affair. Merritt stood on the porch of the saloon, flanked by his uniformed men. He held up the permit, its seal catching the noon sun. His voice was calm and commanding, the voice of a man used to being obeyed. He spoke of progress, of securing the town's water supply against drought and Navajo interference. He promised that the dam would bring prosperity. When a few of the more anxious townsfolk voiced their fears about Canyon Jack's retaliation, Merritt's smile was thin and confident. Canyon Jack and his kind only understand strength. He declared, With the completion of this project and the presence of my men, Dry Needle will be safer than it has ever been. We will not be intimidated by renegades." From the shade of the livery stable across the street, Nora and Ashki watched the scene unfold. They saw the mixture of hope and fear on the faces in the crowd. Merritt was a master at playing on those emotions, turning the town's fear into his weapon. The people were being divided, pitted against their neighbors, all for the sake of a company's greed. When the meeting broke up, they slipped away, heading out of town along the dry creek bed. They needed to talk, to plan their next move, and there were no safe places left within the town limits. The sun was hot, and the air was still and heavy. The sky, which had been a clear, bleached blue, was beginning to take on a hazy, yellow tint at the horizon. Ashki stopped, his head tilted, listening not with his ears but with his whole body. "A storm is coming," he said. "A bad one. We need to find shelter." The wind picked up suddenly, a low moan that quickly grew into a shriek. The world dissolved into a blinding, stinging whirlwind of red sand. Nora could not see, could barely breathe. The dust was like a physical blow, forcing its way into her eyes, her nose, her mouth. Panic began to rise in her chest. Then Ashki's hand was on her arm, his grip firm and steady. He pulled her along, his body a shield against the worst of the gale. He seemed to navigate by instinct, leading her through the disorienting chaos until they reached the base of a rock outcropping. He pushed her into a narrow crevice between two large boulders, a small pocket of relative calm in the heart of the storm. He pulled the blue neckerchief from his throat and handed it to her. "Cover your face," he commanded, his voice raised to be heard over the roar of the wind. He wedged himself into the opening of the crevice, his broad shoulders blocking the direct blast of the sand. He unbuttoned his heavy canvas coat and held it up, creating a more substantial barrier. The fury of the storm lessened to a bearable assault. Nora huddled in the small space, the fine fabric of his neckerchief over her nose and mouth. It scent faintly of sage and smoke. Time lost all meaning. There was only the sound of the wind, a relentless, deafening scream, and the secure presence of the man shielding her. She could feel the tremors in the rock as the wind battered it. He was so still, so patient, a part of the rock itself. He passed her his canteen, and she took a grateful sip of the warm, metallic tasting water. "Do you have a plan?" she shouted, the question feeling foolish as soon as it left her lips. He turned his head slightly, and she could just make out the line of his jaw in the dim, swirling light. "Yes," he shouted back. "Survive now. Talk about being heroes later." His words, so practical and devoid of false bravado, anchored her. They were not heroes. They were just two people in a storm, trying to stay alive. And in that moment, huddled in the dark, she trusted him completely. Hours later, the wind began to lose its fury, its shriek diminishing to a weary sigh. A strange, orange twilight filtered through the dust that still hung thick in the air. When they finally emerged, the landscape was transformed, softened and reshaped by the sand. The world was eerily quiet. They made their way back to Dry Needle as darkness fell, moving through a town that seemed stunned and subdued by the storm's passage. The lamps of Ruth's boarding house were a welcome beacon. But as they approached the porch, the front door was thrown open and two of Merritt's men stepped out, their rifles held ready. "We're looking for the Navajo," one of them said to Ruth, who stood in the doorway, her arms crossed. "Captain's orders. Search every building." Ruth did not flinch. "He is not here, and you are not setting one muddy boot inside my clean house without a warrant from a real lawman." From the shadows of the neighboring building, Ashki pulled Nora back. There was no way in through the front. He moved silently along the side of the house, to a low window that led into the kitchen pantry. Inside, they could see Ruth arguing with the men, her voice sharp and unyielding. Suddenly, Ruth glanced toward the pantry window, a quick, almost imperceptible flicker of her eyes. It was a signal. Ashki slid the window open. He motioned for Nora to go first, then followed, dropping silently to the floor. The kitchen was empty. Heavy footsteps sounded in the main room. Ruth's voice came, low and urgent, from the doorway. "The root cellar, now!" She pointed to a trapdoor hidden beneath a braided rug. Ashki lifted it, revealing a set of steep wooden steps leading down into blackness. Nora scrambled down, her heart pounding. Ashki followed, pulling the heavy door closed just as the sound of boots entered the kitchen. They were plunged into absolute darkness, the air thick with the smell of damp earth, potatoes, and stored apples. Above them, they heard the heavy tread of the searchers, their voices muffled by the floorboards, shaking dust down onto their heads. Nora held her breath, every muscle tense, listening to the hunt in the world above. The sound of the boots faded, a door slammed, and then a profound silence settled over the house, a quiet so deep it felt louder than the noise that came before it. In the blackness of the root cellar, Nora could hear the frantic beat of her own heart and the steady, calm rhythm of Ashki's breathing beside her. A sliver of yellow light appeared as the trapdoor was lifted. Ruth Caldwell's face, etched with worry but resolute, looked down at them. "They're gone," she said, her voice a low command. "For now, come on out before you start taking root." They emerged into the warm, lamp-lit kitchen, blinking in the sudden brightness. Nora's dress was smudged with dirt, and a cobweb was tangled in her hair. Ashki looked as if he had just stepped out for a casual stroll, his composure an unbreachable wall. Ruth pushed mugs of fresh, hot coffee into their hands. "This is a bad business," the older woman said, her eyes moving between the two of them. "Merritt is not just a bully. He is methodical. He is turning this town into his own private kingdom." "We need more than suspicions," Nora said, her hands warming around the mug. "We need proof that will stand up, something a real marshal would have to act on." Ashki stared into the dark liquid in his cup, but did not drink. The hunt, the need to hide, the violation of a safe home, it had stirred something cold and hard inside him. The urge to ride out, to meet violence with violence, was a powerful current pulling at him. But he had seen where that path led. It ended in graves and sorrow. He had to be smarter. He had to be stronger in a different way. "I will go to my family's camp," he said, his voice quiet but final. "I need to see my sister, to warn them, and I need to think." He looked at Nora. "Keep the papers safe. Do not trust anyone else." He left as he had arrived, a shadow melting into the deeper shadows of the night. Miles away, in the relative comfort of the railroad's local headquarters, Captain Silas Merritt sat at his desk, reading a letter delivered by a special courier. The paper was expensive, the handwriting inelegant, sharp script from his employer, the president of the Elkhorn Company, a man who resided in a world of mahogany and stock tickers back east. The instructions were concise and brutal. "Close the waterway before the first autumn rains. The drought has driven land prices down. A flood will make them worthless. Purchase all affected parcels for pennies on the dollar afterward. Mr. Jack's manufactured hostilities should provide ample justification for any decisive actions required. Do not fail." Merritt folded the letter, a thin, satisfied smile on his face. He was not just building a dam. He was engineering a financial masterpiece of ruin and acquisition. Ashki reached the collection of hogans nestled in a small, sheltered canyon just before dawn. The air smelled of cedar smoke and damp earth. His sister, She'e, met him outside, her face serene but her eyes full of questions. Inside, their grandmother, Hastian, sat by the central fire pit, her ancient face a beautiful landscape of wrinkles, her hands never still as she spun wool. He spoke to her in their own language, his voice softer, the hard edges worn away by the familiarity of home. He told her of the iron rails, the dam, the threat to the water. She listened without interruption, her gaze never leaving his. When he finished, she spoke. "The people who think they can own water do not understand the land. The two is not a thing to be chained. It is the spine of the earth. It is the blood of our ancestors. If you break its flow, you break the back of the people." She placed a small bundle of dried herbs on the fire. A fragrant, cleansing smoke filled the hogan. "Remember your brother," she said softly, her words a sharp, painful memory. "He fought with his hands. You must fight with your head and your heart. Do not betray the water. Do not betray the people. This is the path of a warrior." Her words settled the storm inside him. The path was not one of vengeance, but of preservation. It was harder, longer, but it was the only one that honored the promise woven into the fabric of his neckerchief. Back in Dry Needle, the days that followed were thick with a quiet, anxious tension. Nora found an unlikely solace in Ruth Caldwell's company. One afternoon, in the boarding house's dusty backyard, Ruth pressed a small, heavy, pearl-handled pistol into Nora's hand. "This was my husband's," Ruth said, her tone matter-of-fact. "He was a good man, but he thought words were enough to solve any problem. He was wrong." She showed Nora how to load it, how to hold it, how to aim. Nora's hands trembled at first, the cold weight of the weapon feeling alien and terrible. "I cannot," she whispered. "You can," Ruth said firmly. "This is not for starting fights. This is for finishing them. It is for keeping the polite men polite, and the impolite ones at a distance. Out here, a woman's word is only as strong as her ability to back it up. Now, aim for that fence post." The first shot was jarringly loud. Kicking her hand back, it missed the post by a foot. But with Ruth's patient instruction, Nora's shots grew steadier. A grim determination replaced her fear. The lessons were about more than marksmanship. They were about claiming her own space, her own survival, in a world that would gladly chew her up and spit her out. The emotional ground shifted again 2 days later. Young Mateo, the rail yard scavenger, collapsed with a raging fever. The town's doctor was away on his circuit, and the boy's mother was frantic. Ruth, hearing the news, brought the sweating, delirious child to the boarding house. Nora did what she could, applying cool cloths, but the fever would not break. A thought struck her, a risk born of desperation. She remembered the quiet competence in Ashki's sister. With Ruth's help, they got Mateo into a wagon and made the slow journey to the Navajo camp. Nora felt a knot of apprehension. She was crossing a line, entering a world she did not understand, a world her own people viewed with suspicion and hostility. Shoye took one look at the boy and immediately went to work. There was no panic, only a focused, gentle efficiency. She brewed a tea from willow bark and other herbs, its bitter scent filling the air. She bathed his face and chest with a cool, minty infusion. She spoke to him in a soft, musical tone. Nora watched, mesmerized. She saw not the primitive medicine she had been taught to expect, but a deep, practiced knowledge of the earth. She saw a community gather, not with morbid curiosity, but with quiet support. She saw family. The prejudice that had been an unconscious part of her upbringing began to crumble, replaced by a profound respect. By morning, Mateo's fever had broken. He was weak, but he was lucid. When Nora returned to town, she looked at everything with new eyes. She saw the fear in her neighbors not as simple hatred, but as an ignorance she herself had shared until a day ago. It made the fight against Merit even more urgent. It was not just about water rights. It was about the soul of the community. That afternoon, driven by a new resolve, she went to the railroad office. Using the excuse of organizing old survey documents, she began poring over maps of the territory. On a large, detailed topographical chart, she found the precise location marked for the dam's construction. She traced the lines of the projected reservoir, the area that would be flooded, and then a cold dread washed over her. The water would not just swallow Navajo farmland. It would swallow the old town cemetery. the final resting place of Dry Needle's first settlers, including Ruth's husband. It was an act of profound disrespect, a violation of the sacred for both cultures. Ashki returned that evening. He, Nora, and Ruth gathered in the kitchen. The door bolted, the curtains drawn. The low drip of water from a leaky trough outside the window was a slow, steady drumbeat counting down their time. Nora laid out the manifest and the decoded telegram. "I have this," she said, her voice tight with purpose, "and I know where they plan to build." She pointed to the spot on the map. "They will flood the cemetery." Ruth's face hardened into a mask of cold fury. Ashki looked at the map, his expression grim. "They seek to erase the past of everyone who stands in their way." "It is not enough," Ashki stated. "A manifest can be explained away. A telegram can be denied. We need the one thing that ties merit directly to this, the territorial permit. It must be a forgery." "But how do we prove it?" Nora asked. "We need three things," Ashki said, his voice taking on the quiet authority of a leader. He was no longer conflicted. His grandmother's words had given him a solid foundation. The manifest, the telegram, and the proof of the forged signature. "We have two. We must find the third." He paused. "And we must stop the work from beginning. We can disrupt their supply lines, spook their horses, break their tools. We will delay them, but we will not kill them. We will fight this on our terms, not theirs." A plan began to form. A desperate, three-headed strategy: evidence, legal challenge, and non-lethal sabotage. It was the hard path, the long path, but it was the right one. As they talked, Nora scraped her hand on a nail sticking out from the table. It was a minor scratch, but it drew blood, without a word. Ashki untied the dark blue neckerchief from his throat. He tore a strip from it and gently, carefully, wrapped it around her hand, tying a neat, firm knot. The gesture was more binding than any spoken promise. It was a silent seal on their alliance. They were in this together. Their planning was cut short by a frantic pounding on the back door. Ruth unbolted it to find a breathless stable hand, his eyes wide with fear. "It's Deputy Harlan," the boy gasped. "He's gone Canyon Jack's men. They just took him. Rode out of town with him slung over a horse. Said he was a traitor." The stable hand's words hung in the air. A death sentence for a good man. Panic was a useless luxury. Action was the only currency that mattered. Ashki's face was stone, but his mind moved like a hawk sighting its prey. He questioned the boy, his voice low and sharp, extracting details. A remote line cabin, one used by horse traders, set back in the rocky bluffs west of town. That was where they had taken Deputy Harlan. "Ruth, you know horses better than any man in this town," Ashki said, his eyes finding the older woman's in the dim light. "Can you get a sturdy wagon and two fast animals without raising an alarm?" Ruth's jaw was set in a hard line. "I can have them hitched behind the livery in 20 minutes. The bay geldings, they run like the wind." "Nora," Ashki turned to her, his gaze intense. "You will need a sharp knife. When we get in, you go for the ropes. Nothing else. Cut him free. Can you do that?" She met his gaze. The band of his own cloth tied around her hand, a tangible link between them. The woman who had trembled holding a pistol was gone. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and steady. There was no wasted motion. While Ruth slipped out to the stables, Nora retrieved a sharp skinning knife from the kitchen. Ashki gathered a small bundle, a length of rope, a canteen, and a pouch of dried, pungent herbs. They moved through the darkened town like wraiths, sticking to the alleys and shadows, the weight of their purpose a heavy cloak around them. The line cabin was little more than a crude wooden box squatting under a rock overhang. A single lantern cast a sickly yellow glow from its one window, and the silhouettes of two guards passed back and forth. The horses were tethered nearby. Ashki led Nora and Ruth to a position on the ridge above, the wind whistling softly through the scrub pine. "They will have a guard inside and two out," Ashki whispered, pointing. "We cannot fight them head-on." He opened his pouch. The herbs were damp and mixed with something that smelled of pitch. "The wind is blowing toward the cabin. I will start a fire with this. It will make a thick, choking smoke, not a flame. It will confuse them." He looked at Ruth. "When the smoke hits, get to the horses. Not the ones belonging to the gang, but the ones they keep in the corral. Stampede them. Make them run past the cabin door. They will be the distraction." He then turned to Nora. "The moment the guards run out, you and I go in. Find Tom. Cut his bonds. We will have only seconds." It was a plan built on wind and shadow and nerve. Ashki crept down the slope, a phantom in the moonlight. Nora and Ruth watched, their hearts hammering against their ribs. They saw him build a small pile of tinder and lay the bundle of herbs on top. A tiny spark from his flint and steel, and a thick, acrid smoke began to billow, low to the ground, carried by the breeze directly toward the cabin. Almost immediately, there was a shout. The door flew open, and a man stumbled out, coughing and waving his arms. The two outside guards ran toward the source of the smoke, their rifles at the ready. That was Ruth's cue. She moved with the speed of a much younger woman, slipping through the rocks, unlatching the corral gate, and slapping the rumps of the startled horses with the flat of her hand. They exploded out of the pen, a wave of thundering hooves and panicked whinnies, charging past the front of the cabin. The chaos was their cover. Ashki grabbed Nora's arm. "Now!" They sprinted for the open door. Inside, the smoke was thick, stinging their eyes. Tom Harlan was slumped in a chair, his head lolling, his hands tied behind him. A third man, his face a mask of confusion, was just turning from the window. He was a big man, but Ashki was faster. He did not aim to injure, only to disable. He slammed into the man's side, driving him into the wall. The man's head hit the timber with a dull thud, and he slid to the floor. Nora. She was already there, the knife flashing in the lantern light. The ropes were thick, but the blade was sharp. One strand parted, then another. Tom moaned, his eyes fluttering open. He was bruised and his breathing was shallow. "We have to go," Ashki said, pulling the dazed deputy to his feet. They half carried, half dragged him out into the night. Another figure was there, waiting in the confusion. A tall man with a lean, wolfish face and eyes that seemed to have seen too much of the world's cruelty. He held a pistol, but it was not aimed at them. It was aimed at the two returning guards. "Get him in the wagon," the man said, his voice a low growl. It was Canyon Jack. The two guards skidded to a halt, their faces a mixture of fear and confusion. "Jack, what are you doing?" Merritt said. "I take my orders from the man who pays me," Jack snarled. "And right now, I have new orders." He motioned with his gun. "Drop your rifles." Ashki did not hesitate. He trusted the moment, not the man. He and Nora bundled Tom into the back of the waiting wagon, where Ruth already held the reins. Ashki met Jack's eyes over the deputy's slumped form. There was something familiar in the man's stance, in the way he held his head. "You were a scout," Ashki said, the realization hitting him. "With the army, at the San Carlos reservation?" A bitter smile twisted Jack's lips. "A long time ago, before they decided they did not need us anymore. They taught us to track and fight, then threw us away like spent cartridges. Merritt, he pays well, and he lets me bite the hand that used to feed me. He was a man hollowed out by betrayal, filled back up with pure spite." "He is using you," Ashki said. "Everyone uses everyone," Jack shot back. "Now get out of here before I change my mind." He fired a shot into the air, and the two guards flinched. "Go!" Ruth needed no further encouragement. She snapped the reins, and the bay geldings lunged forward, pulling the wagon away from the cabin at a jarring pace. Nora looked back once to see Canyon Jack standing alone, a solitary, conflicted figure watching them disappear into the night. Their flight was a frantic race through a maze of canyons and dry washes. Ruth handled the team with an expert hand, but the terrain was treacherous. As they careened around a sharp bend, a shower of pebbles rained down from the canyon wall above them. Merritt's men were in pursuit. "They are trying to cut us off," Ruth shouted over the clatter of the wheels. A rifle shot cracked, and a splinter of wood flew from the side of the wagon. The geldings, spooked, tried to bolt. "I cannot hold them steady and drive," Ruth yelled. Without a second thought, Nora scrambled into the driver's seat. "Give me the reins. You and Ashki hold Tom down." She took the leather straps in her hands, her knuckles white. She had driven wagons on the flat farmlands of Pennsylvania, but this was like trying to steer a ship in a hurricane. The wind whipped her hair across her face, and the wagon bucked and swayed, threatening to splinter apart. She focused, her mind shutting out the fear, seeing only the path ahead. She remembered her father's words, "Feel the horses, do not fight them, guide them." She eased the pressure on the left rein, letting the lead horse find its footing on a patch of slick rock. She leaned into a sharp turn, shifting her weight to keep the wheels from lifting. A section of the trail ahead had crumbled away, leaving a narrow, precarious ledge. There was no time to stop. She gave the horses their head, urging them on with her voice, and they flew across the gap, the wagon groaning in protest as it landed hard on the other side. They were through. The sound of pursuit faded behind them. They found a sheltered alcove to rest, the horses heaving, their flanks lathered in sweat. Tom Harlan was conscious, but barely. He coughed, a weak, rattling sound. "Nora," he whispered, his eyes struggling to focus on her. "Merritt? He keeps everything in the office, a false bottom in the big steel filing cabinet." He coughed again, his body trembling. "The combination, it is a telegraph code, a date, from the war." His eyes rolled back in his head, and he went limp. Nora felt a cold dread followed by a hot surge of anger. He had risked his life to give them that. She would not let it be in vain. The fear, the feeling that she was just a secretary caught up in something too big for her. It was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but now it was mixed with a fiery resolve. She looked at Ashki, his face illuminated by the pale moonlight. "I am going in there," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "I can open that cabinet." She managed a small, grim smile. "If no one is going to give me a seat at the table, I will just have to take the whole desk." Leaving Ruth to care for Tom in a hidden spot, Nora and Ashki made their way back to Dry Needle. The town was quiet, but it was the unnatural quiet of a place holding its breath. The railroad office was a dark shape against the starry sky. A single windmill creaked nearby, its slow, rhythmic groan like the town's weary heartbeat. A church bell tolled once, marking the dead of night. Ashki scaled the side of the building with the silent grace of a mountain cat, taking up a position on the flat roof where he could watch the street. Nora, her pilfered office key in hand, slipped the lock on the back door and slid inside. The air was stale, smelling of ink and cold metal. She lit a small lantern, keeping the flame low. The filing cabinet stood against the far wall, a steel monolith. She ran her fingers along the bottom, finding the faint outline of a hidden panel. The lock was a dial, but instead of numbers, it had the dots and dashes of Morse code. A date. Tom had set a date from the war. What date would be important to a man like Merritt? She tried several famous battles. Nothing. Then she thought of the man himself, vain, proud of his service. She tried the date of his officer's commission, a date she had seen on the paperwork in his file. She clicked the dial. ... The lock clicked open. Inside was a ledger and a stack of papers. Her hands shook as she pulled them out. It was all there, the original, unencrypted telegrams to and from the Elkhorn president, the real shipping manifests, listing Canyon Jack as a paid contractor, the detailed plans for the dam and the subsequent land purchases. They had him. They had everything. As she gathered the documents, a faint hissing sound reached her ears. She froze. It was coming from the potbelly stove in the corner. She raised her lantern. Tucked beneath the stove, almost invisible in the shadows, was a bundle of blasting sticks. A slow burning fuse was already halfway to its destination. It was a trap. The door was too far away. The window was small, high on the wall. "Ashki!" she screamed. The world exploded in motion. The window above her shattered inward as Ashki dropped from the roof. Landing in a crouch, he saw the fuse in the same instant she did. There was no time to think. He scooped her up into his arms as if she weighed nothing and lunged for the small storage room at the back. He kicked the door open, threw them both through the opening, and covered her body with his own. The explosion was a deafening roar that shook the very foundations of the town. The wall blew outward, and a wave of heat and splinters washed over them. For a moment, there was only a ringing in her ears and the heavy, solid weight of Ashki protecting her. He slowly pushed himself up, his face grimy with soot. They stumbled out through the splintered remains of the back wall into the cold night air, coughing, their ears still ringing. The office was a funeral pyre, the flames licking at the night sky, consuming the evidence they had just found. But Nora still clutched the ledger and the papers to her chest. They had survived. They had the proof. They looked at each other, their faces black with soot, their clothes torn. A shared, hysterical laugh bubbled up from Nora's throat. Ashki's face broke into a rare, weary grin. "Tomorrow morning, you can be the hero," she gasped, leaning against the wall for support. Tonight, I am just happy to be alive." Their relief was short-lived. Shouts and bells began to ring out across the town. Figures ran toward the fire, and then Captain Merritt's voice rose above the din, cold and authoritative. "The saboteur has been found," he bellowed, his voice carrying across the square. It was the Navajo. "Ashki, he has committed arson against the railroad. There is a $500 reward for his capture, dead or alive." The night air was still cold and sharp with the ghost of the explosion. Merritt's accusation echoed in the sudden, shocked silence of the town. A poison arrow shot into the heart of the chaos. There was no time for deliberation. Every man with a gun and a greedy thought would soon be a hunter, and Ashki was the quarry. He and Nora slipped back into the labyrinth of alleys, the precious ledger and papers clutched in Nora's hands, the smell of smoke clinging to them like a second skin. They found Ruth where they had left her, crouched over Tom Harlan in a dry wash, her face a grim mask in the moonlight. She took in their soot-stained faces and torn clothes, her eyes lingering on the papers in Nora's grasp. "The fire was a trap," Nora whispered, the words scratching her raw throat. Merritt was waiting. He named Ashki. "Then he cannot stay here," Ruth said, her voice flat and hard. "They will tear this town apart looking for him." She looked at Tom, who was stirring, his moans thin and weak. "And this one needs a real healer, not just a stubborn old woman with a canteen." The decision was made without being spoken. The only place of safety for either man was in the hidden canyon with Ashki's people. The journey was a slow, agonizing trek through the darkness. Ashki moved ahead, scouting the path, while Nora and Ruth supported the barely conscious deputy between them, his dead weight a constant, draining burden. By the time they reached the sanctuary of the Hogans, the eastern sky was beginning to pale. Ashki's sister, Shie, took charge of Tom with the same quiet competence she had shown with Mateo, her brow furrowed with concern at the extent of his injuries. Ashki, his face grim, told his family what had happened, the bounty now hanging over his head. He was a fugitive in his own land. The lie of the arson spread through Dry Needle faster than the fire itself. Fear, fanned by Merritt's agents and nurtured by years of simmering prejudice, took root. Ranchers whose cattle drank from the same creek as the Navajo suddenly saw them as a threat. Men who had traded peacefully for years now looked at any native face with suspicion. Nora felt the chill of it when she returned to her post. The telegraph key felt cold beneath her fingers. The few people who came into the station looked through her, their greetings non-existent, their business conducted in clipped, hostile tones. She was isolated, branded by her association with the accused. Her one bastion of support was Ruth Caldwell. The widow would arrive at the station each day at noon, carrying a basket. Inside would be a thick slice of apple pie or a warm biscuit, and tucked beside it, the heavy, reassuring shape of her late husband's Remington revolver. "Let them stare," Ruth would say, her voice a low growl. "Fear makes folks stupid. Nora and Captain Merritt is selling stupidity by the barrel." Merritt did not wait for the stupidity to wear off. He pressed his advantage. Using the law as a club, he sent for a traveling circuit judge, a man named Ferris, whose robes were stained with whiskey and whose eyes had the dull sheen of a man whose morals were for sale. In a hastily convened session in the saloon, with Merritt's armed guards lining the walls, Judge Ferris signed a legal injunction. Citing the immediate threat of insurrection, the order authorized Merritt's men to confiscate all firearms from the Navajo settlements within a 5-mile radius of the Verde Creek. It was a legal disarmament, a stripping away of their right to self-defense, all under the false color of law. The land itself seemed to rebel against the injustice. 3 days after the fire, the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise. A wind rose, not with the sudden fury of the last one, but with a slow, building menace. It was another sandstorm, bigger and more powerful than the one before. It was a scouring wind, a storm that seemed intent on wiping the slate of the world clean. It buried the survey stakes Merritt's men had planted along the creek, erasing the lines of their planned conquest. It tore at the makeshift shelters of the work crews, sending them scurrying back to the safety of the town. For Ashki and his people, it was a fearsome but familiar adversary. While Merritt's men hid, Ashki was in his element. He led a small group, including his sister, out into the teeth of the gale. A small herd of sheep and cattle belonging to one of the few white ranchers who had refused to join the chorus of blame had been caught in an open flatland. Navigating by the shape of the wind and the feel of the ground, Ashki led the rescue. The air was a maelstrom of sand, visibility reduced to mere feet. In the chaos, a spooked steer, maddened by the wind, broke from the herd and charged blindly. Mateo, who had insisted on helping, was directly in its path. Cheye moved without thinking, shoving the boy hard. He tumbled out of the way as she took the glancing impact of the animal's shoulder. She was thrown against the splintered rails of a broken corral fence. The steer thundered past. Ashki was at his sister's side in an instant. The composure he always wore was gone, shattered. In its place was a raw, naked fear. It was the same fear that had seized him the day he had watched his older brother fall. For a heartbeat, he was frozen, the horror of losing another person he loved paralyzing him. Shoy groaned, pushing herself up. Her arm was gashed and bruised, but not broken. The sight of her moving, of her being alive, broke the spell. He helped her to her feet, his hands gentle. But Nora, who had been helping to calm the animals, saw the tremor in them. She saw the crack in the stone. They brought the livestock to shelter, their mission successful, but the incident left a dark mark. Ashki was withdrawn, his silence heavier than before. He had shown his people how to survive the storm, but he had also revealed his deepest weakness. Back at the camp, under Cheye's care, Tom Harlan was slowly regaining his strength. The day after the storm, his fever broke for good. He was weak, his voice a reedy whisper, but his mind was clear. He called Nora and Ashki to his bedside. "The permit," he rasped, his eyes finding theirs. "The territorial seal. It's a fake. Merritt had it made." He paused, gathering his breath. "There is an engraver in Prescott, a man named Elias Reed. He is a good man, but he has a weakness for drink and cards. Merritt owns his debts. He forced Reed to make the seal." He coughed, a dry, painful sound. Reed keeps a private log, every job he does. He is scared. He will talk, if someone can get to him before Merritt does. It was the final piece, the third leg of the stool, the proof that could bring the whole corrupt enterprise crashing down. But Prescott was 100 miles away, a dangerous journey through open country for a man with a bounty on his head. The weight of it all seemed to settle in the small hogan. The pressure was immense. Ashki's sister was injured. His people were being disarmed. He was a wanted man. That evening, Nora found him outside, sharpening his knife on a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone, a harsh, grating sound in the quiet dusk. His movements were tight with a contained fury. She saw the rage in him, and she mistook its target. "You cannot," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You cannot go after Canyon Jack. Not like this, an ambush, a quick knife in the dark. It will solve nothing. It will only prove Merritt right." He stopped, his hand still on the knife. He looked up at her, his eyes dark pools of anger and pain. "You think I do not know that he hurt my sister? His men are taking our guns, the ones we need to hunt, to protect ourselves. Your way, the long way, the path of paper and proof, it feels like a slow death while my family is in danger." "And your way feels like a fast one," she retorted, her own frustration boiling over. "We are so close. Ashki, we have the ledger. We have the telegrams. We know about the seal. If you throw that all away for revenge, then what was any of this for? What did Tom almost die for?" The argument was sharp and painful because it was born not of dislike, but of a deep, conflicting care. They stood in the twilight, a chasm of culture and experience between them. He saw her as naive to the brutal realities of survival. She saw him as perilously close to embracing the very violence they were fighting against. The standoff was broken by a small, sad gesture. He held up his hand, and she saw the dark blue neckerchief he had used to bandage her hand was still tied there. It was torn and frayed from the explosion. "The world is a hard place," he said, his voice rough. "Things break." The anger drained out of her, replaced by a wave of empathy. "Yes," she whispered. "They do." She stepped forward. "But they can also be mended." She gently untied the ruined cloth from his wrist. She took it inside, and by the light of a small lamp, she found a needle and a spool of thin copper wire she used for repairing the telegraph equipment. With painstaking care, she began to stitch the tear in the heavy woven cloth. The fine, metallic thread was a stark contrast to the dark blue fabric, a seam of shimmering copper holding the pieces of his tradition together. It was an act of quiet patience, a testament to the long, difficult path she believed in. When she finished, she brought it back to him. He took it from her, his calloused fingers tracing the line of her careful stitches. He did not say thank you. The words were not necessary. He tied it back around his throat, the repaired cloth a symbol of their renewed, if fragile, pact. "Prescott," he said, the single word a decision. "We will ride at sunset." The air was cleared. The path ahead was perilous, but it was a path they would walk together. As the sun bled its last colors across the horizon, they made their preparations. Ruth would stay to watch over Tom and be their eyes and ears in Dry Needle. Ashki and Nora would make for Prescott. They rode out not as victors, but as fugitives and pilgrims, seeking a justice that seemed as distant and uncertain as the far-off mountains silhouetted against the dying light. The journey to Prescott was a long climb into a different world. They left the red rock and dust of the low desert behind, ascending into the high country of the Mongolian Rim. The air grew thin and sharp, tasting of pine and cold stone. They traveled mostly by night, a necessity for a man with a price on his head, resting during the heat of the day in hidden arroyos or thick stands of juniper. A sliver of moon hung in an ink-black sky littered with a spray of impossibly bright stars, providing just enough light to see the treacherous trail ahead. On the third night, they made camp beside a small, clear creek that tumbled over smooth granite rocks. The sound of the water was a gentle, cleansing whisper in the immense silence of the high plateau. Ashki built a small, smokeless fire in a pit, its warmth a fragile shield against the profound cold that seeped out of the earth and the pines. They sat on opposite sides of the flames, the firelight dancing on their weary faces, enclosed in a small bubble of warmth and light in a vast wilderness. The quiet between them was no longer the tense, watchful silence of their first meetings. It was a comfortable space, worn smooth by shared danger and mutual reliance. Nora watched him as he stared into the flames, his face a study in stoic resolve. But she saw the shadow of his sister's injury and the weight of the bounty in the hard line of his jaw. "You told me once that words are heavy," she said softly, her voice barely disturbing the night. "You were right, but sometimes silence is heavier." He looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers across the fire. He seemed to consider her words, to weigh them as he would a set of tracks. "My brother was older than me," he said, his voice a low rumble. "He was a warrior. He believed the only answer to a fist was a harder fist. When the soldiers came to move us from our lands, years ago, he fought. He died with a rifle in his hands, full of anger." Ashki picked up a dry twig and fed it to the fire, watching the flames consume it. "My grandmother says he fought with his hands, but I must fight with my head. I have his anger in my blood, every day. I have to choose not to be him. Sometimes that choice is difficult." The confession hung in the air between them, a rare and precious offering. Nora understood now the source of the conflict she had seen in him, the constant war between his warrior's instinct and his chosen path of patient justice. She felt a need to offer something of her own, to meet his vulnerability with hers. "My husband's name was Michael," she said, her gaze turning inward, back to a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. "He was an engineer from Philadelphia. He loved books and believed in progress. He believed the railroad was a great and noble thing, a way of taming the wilderness." She gave a small, sad smile. "He never saw the wilderness. He only saw the lines on his maps. He died of a fever in a canvas tent beside the tracks in Kansas, 100 miles from anywhere. The great and noble railroad just kept moving west. It did not even stop to mark his grave." His pain reflected her own. They were two people shaped by loss, bereaved by the very forces that defined the West, the clash of cultures, the relentless march of progress, and the unforgiving nature of the land itself. The fire crackled, a warm and living heart in the cold darkness. They broke camp before dawn. As they were dousing the fire, they heard it, a faint sound, almost like a wounded animal, carried on the morning breeze. Ashki's head came up, his body instantly alert. He motioned for Nora to stay put and moved into the trees, disappearing as if the forest had simply swallowed him. He returned minutes later, his expression unreadable. "Come," he said, "and be quiet." He led her to a shallow ravine not far from their camp. There, caught in the cruel steel jaws of a trapper's snare, was a little girl. She could not have been more than 6 or 7 years old, her face streaked with dirt and tears, her dark eyes wide with terror. She wore the simple hide dress of an Apache. The trap had closed on her ankle, and the ground around her was scuffed from her frantic struggles. Nora's heart constricted. Ashki knelt beside the child, speaking to her in a language Nora did not know, his voice a gentle, soothing murmur. The girl flinched at first, but his calm presence seemed to quell her panic. He examined the trap, his movements economical and sure. It was an old, powerful model, designed for wolves or coyotes. "I need your help," he said to Nora, not looking up. "When I press the springs, you must pull the jaws apart. They are strong. Do not let them snap shut again." She knelt on the other side of the trap. Ashki placed his hands on the twin steel springs, his muscles bunching under his shirt as he applied steady, immense pressure. The teeth of the trap slowly began to open. Nora slipped her fingers into the gap. the cold metal biting into her skin, and pulled with all her strength. The jaws opened another inch. The little girl cried out, a sharp whimper of pain and fear. "Hold it," Ashki commanded. With his free hand, he gently worked the child's small, swollen ankle from between the metal teeth. Nora's arms trembled with the strain, her muscles burning, but she held on until the girl's leg was free. Ashki let the pressure off the springs, and the trap snapped shut with a vicious clang. The girl's ankle was badly bruised and cut, but the bone did not appear to be broken. Ashki cleaned the wound with water from his canteen and bound it with a strip of clean cloth. He then lifted the child into his arms. She was light as a bird. She had stopped crying and was now watching him with a solemn, trusting gaze. They had to find her people. Their journey to Prescott was no longer a flight, but a rescue mission. The child, whom they learned was named Tali, slowed them down, but neither of them considered any other course of action. They were just turning into a narrow, rock-strewn canyon in the late afternoon when the ambush came. It was not a military operation. It was a clumsy, desperate attack by two prospectors, their faces gaunt with greed, who had likely heard of the bounty in a nearby mining camp. They burst from the rocks, their pistols raised. "That is him!" the Navajo one shouted. Ashki's reaction was instantaneous. He shoved Nora and the child behind a large boulder, shielding them with his body. A pistol shot echoed in the canyon, the bullet ricocheting off the rock near his head. He drew his own pistol, not firing wildly, but aiming with a calm precision that was terrifying to behold. He shot the pistol out of the first man's hand, the weapon clattering to the ground. The second man, bolder or perhaps more foolish, charged forward. Ashki met him halfway. The fight was a brutal, short-lived ballet of violence. Ashki moved with a devastating economy, deflecting a wild punch and using the man's momentum to send him crashing into the canyon wall, where he slumped to the ground, dazed. The first prospector, clutching his stinging hand, had already scrambled away into the rocks. It was over in seconds. Ashki stood breathing heavily, the fury of the fight still in his eyes. He turned to Nora. "Are you hurt?" "No," she said, her voice shaking slightly as she held the trembling child. "Are you?" He shook his head, but she saw a dark line of red welling on his neck, just below his jawline. In the scuffle, he had been scraped by a sharp rock or perhaps the other man's belt buckle. It was not deep, but it was bleeding freely. That night, after they had found a safe place to camp and had gotten Tali to sleep, Nora insisted on tending to the wound. She heated water in her small tin cup, found her sewing kit with the copper wire, and motioned for him to sit. He hesitated for a moment, then complied, sitting by the fire and tilting his head back. First, he had to remove the neckerchief. He untied it slowly, the cloth with her stitches a dark banner in his hands. His throat was exposed, strong and vulnerable in the flickering firelight, with a damp cloth. Nora gently cleaned the cut, her touch as light as a moth's wing. The bleeding had mostly stopped, but the gash was long enough that it needed a stitch or two to close cleanly. "Hold still," she whispered. He was impossibly still, his eyes closed, his body rigid. She threaded her needle. Not with the copper wire this time, but with a fine, strong thread. Her fingers were steady as she drew the edges of the skin together, her movements precise and careful. When she was finished, she snipped the thread and gently wiped away the last traces of blood. For a long moment, her hand lingered on his neck, her thumb resting on the pulse that beat steadily beneath his warm skin. An unspoken current passed between them, a powerful and undeniable connection that went deeper than words or shared danger. On impulse, driven by a feeling she could not name, she leaned forward and pressed her lips softly against the base of his throat, just below his Adam's apple. A tremor ran through his entire body. He drew in a sharp, ragged breath, and his hand came up to cover hers where it rested on his neck. His skin was hot. When he spoke, his voice was a raw, husky whisper, a sound that seemed pulled from the very core of him. "Woman," he breathed, You will make me fall before heaven." The intensity of the moment was a physical thing, a weight in the air around them. Nora pulled back slightly, her heart hammering. A small, shaky smile touched her lips as she tried to lighten the profound gravity of what had just passed between them. "Fall before heaven," she teased gently, "or before me." His eyes opened. They were dark and bottomless in the firelight, full of an emotion she had never seen there before. "You choose heaven," he said, his voice regaining some of its strength. "I choose you." He did not kiss her. The words were enough. He simply kept his hand over hers, his fingers lacing with hers against his throat. They stayed that way for a long time as the fire burned down to glowing embers. Later, as they sat wrapped in their separate blankets against the cold, he reached across the small space between them and took her hand, their fingers intertwined, a silent, solid promise in the darkness. The feeling that grew between them was not a sudden, blazing fire, but a slow, steady warmth, built of small, repeated acts of trust and kindness. They found Tali's village the next day, a small, hidden encampment of Apache. There was a moment of tense suspicion, but when they saw the child, safe and sound, the suspicion melted into a flood of relieved gratitude. Tali's mother wept and embraced Nora, and her father, a stern-faced warrior, gave Ashki a nod of profound, silent respect. They were offered food and a safe place to rest, a brief moment of peace in their hurried journey. They reached Prescott 2 days later, a bustling, noisy town carved out of the pine forest. It was a world away from the quiet desolation of Dry Needle. They found the street where Elias Reed, the engraver, kept his workshop. But where the shop should have been, there was only a blackened, smoking ruin. The building had been burned to the ground. A small crowd of onlookers stood nearby, speaking in hushed tones. Nora approached an older man watching the scene. "What happened?" she asked, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. "Fire, last night," the man said, shaking his head. "Took the whole place. Poor Elias Reed. He is gone, vanished. Some say he fled his debts, but I saw the tracks this morning, before the sheriff's men trampled them all." He lowered his voice. "Looked like the work of Canyon Jack's men to me. They do not leave witnesses." The smell of wet ash and despair hung heavy in the Prescott morning air. The hope that had carried them 100 miles died in the smoking skeleton of the engraver's workshop. Ashki stood staring at the ruin, his fists clenched at his sides, a cold, hard rage building behind his eyes. Another dead end, another life ruined or extinguished by Merritt's long, shadowy reach. For a moment, Nora felt the crushing weight of defeat settle on her shoulders. They had come so far only to find the last piece of their puzzle turned to cinders. "No," she said, her voice a fierce whisper aimed as much at herself as at him. He would not have destroyed everything. A man like that, a craftsman, he would have tried to save his tools, his molds. She pushed past the gawking onlookers, ignoring the soot that immediately stained the hem of her dusty skirt. The local sheriff's deputy, a young man with an oversized badge and an overwhelmed expression, tried to stop her. "Ma'am, you cannot go in there. It is a crime scene." "A crime has already been committed," Nora shot back, her gaze sweeping over the charred timbers and collapsed roof. "I am trying to find the evidence of it." Her conviction gave the deputy pause. Ashki moved to her side, his presence a silent, intimidating wall that made the young lawman take a step back. They began their search not in the main wreckage, but around the periphery. Nora's mind worked with a desperate logic. If you were fleeing a fire, what would you grab? What would you discard? It was Ashki who found the first sign. His eyes, trained to see the slightest disturbance in the natural world, noticed something amiss with the iron grate of a storm drain at the edge of the alley behind the shop. It was slightly askew, and the dirt around it was scuffed. He lifted the heavy grate. The channel below was dark and slick with grime. He pointed. Wedged against the stone siding was a small, heavy object, something that had not washed down with the usual street debris. He reached in and pulled it out. It was a block of lead, warped and partially melted on one side, but the other side was unmistakable. It held the reverse impression of a portion of the Great Seal of the Arizona Territory. The fire had been hot enough to deform it, but not destroy it. In its melted state, it was a more powerful symbol than they could have hoped for truth, distorted by heat and violence, but still recognizable. They tried to melt it down. Nora breathed, her fingers tracing the raised letters, to get rid of the proof. As she pieced the fragments of their plan back together, a woman watched them from the doorway of the boarding house across the street. She was a thin, weary-looking woman with faded eyes and hands that were raw from work. After a moment's hesitation, she crossed the street. "You are looking for Elias?" she asked, her voice brittle. "We are," Nora said carefully. "We believe he was in trouble." The woman gave a bitter, humorless laugh. Elias was always in trouble. Drink, cards. But this was different. She looked around, her gaze fearful. "I am Martha Reed. I was his wife. I left him 6 months ago. But he was not a bad man, just a weak one." She motioned for them to follow her, leading them away from the ruin and into the relative privacy of her boarding house's small, tidy parlor. "A man came to see him a few weeks back," Martha said, her hands twisting a loose thread on her apron. "A captain from the railroad. Drove him out to the woods. When Elias came back, he was a changed man, terrified. He told me the captain had paid off all his debts, but that he now owned him. He made Elias carve that seal." She looked at the lead block in Nora's hand and flinched. Elias kept a logbook, a private one. Recorded every job, every payment. He was afraid. You see, he thought it might protect him. "Do you know where it is?" Ashki's voice was low, intense. Martha shook her head. "He would not tell me. He said it was his only insurance. After the captain's visit, he told me to take what was mine and go to my sister's. He said he did not want me to get caught in the undertow when it all went bad." A tear traced a clean path through the weariness on her cheek. Maybe he was a better man than I gave him credit for. Nora's heart sank. Another dead end. But then Martha's eyes lit with a sudden memory. Wait, he was always scribbling numbers. Dates. He said a man's life was written in his dates. She went to a small writing desk and pulled out a tattered copy of a farmer's almanac. Tucked inside was a scrap of paper with a series of numbers written in Elias's neat, precise hand. I never knew what they meant. Nora looked at the numbers. They were not dates. They were coordinates, like the ones used on survey maps. She immediately thought of the one place Elias might consider safe, a place no one would think to look, the cemetery. They found it on a hill overlooking the town. Following the coordinates from the almanac, they arrived at a simple, weathered headstone for a man who had died a decade earlier. Ashki knelt, examining the base of the stone. He ran his fingers along the bottom edge, then began to dig carefully in the soft earth. A few inches down, his fingers struck something hard. It was a small, oilskin-wrapped package. Inside was a thin, leather-bound ledger. Elias Reed's insurance. As they stood by the grave, the weight of the logbook a solid promise in Nora's hands. A flicker of movement at the end of the street caught Ashki's eye. A man, lean and wolfish, was just leaving the assayer's office. He turned, and for a split second, his eyes met theirs. Canyon Jack. Recognition and alarm flashed across his face. He turned and ran. "He is not getting away," Ashki said, his voice a low growl. He handed Nora the logbook. "Keep this safe. Stay here." He was gone before she could protest. A blur of motion. The chase was on. Jack was fast, weaving through the crowded, dusty main street of Prescott. He dodged wagons and startled pedestrians, heading for the maze of alleys and workshops that clung to the hillside. Ashki did not follow directly. He cut through a livery stable, his long strides eating up the ground, his mind mapping the town, anticipating his quarry's moves. Jack scrambled up a pile of crates onto the low roof of a tannery. hoping to lose his pursuer in the jumble of rooftops. The corrugated tin was hot under the midday sun, shimmering with heat. He ran, his boots clattering on the metal, and then froze. Ashki was waiting for him on the next roof, having climbed up from the other side, cutting off his escape. He stood silhouetted against the bright sky, as inevitable as a force of nature. With a curse, Jack leaped across the alley to the roof of a laundry, the smell of hot lye and steam rising to meet him. Ashki followed in a single, fluid motion. They raced across the hot, rattling tin. A desperate, high-altitude chase. Jack, seeing he was outmatched in speed, turned to fight. He pulled a long knife from his boot, its blade glinting in the sun. The fight was not a prolonged, dramatic duel. It was a quick, brutal, and practical affair. Jack lunged, and Ashki sidestepped, letting the knife slash through empty air. He did not try to disarm Jack. He simply struck the man's elbow with the heel of his hand. A sharp, precise blow that sent a shockwave of pain up Jack's arm, making his fingers go numb. The knife clattered to the roof. Before Jack could recover, Ashki swept his legs out from under him. He went down hard, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs. Ashki was on him, a knee on his chest, a hand on his throat. "It is over," Ashki said, his voice devoid of emotion. Jack lay there, gasping for air, a bloody line on his forehead where he had hit the tin. Defeat and a deep, world-weary bitterness filled his eyes. "Merritt," he rasped. "He is moving up the timeline. He is not waiting for the rains. The dam goes up in 3 days. He coughed, a raw, painful sound. He has hired a new crew, 30 men, old miners and ex-soldiers. He is giving them all new rifles and calling them the Dry Needle Citizens Militia. He plans to start a war he knows you cannot win." Nora arrived, breathless from her run, to find them on the rooftop. She saw the defeated outlaw and the cold fury in Ashki's face. "We have him," Ashki said, his hand still tight on Jack's throat. "Now he will face justice." "We will take him to the marshal," Nora said, pulling the documents from her satchel. "We will let the law handle this." The law. Ashki looked at her, his eyes blazing. "His victims are back at the Verde Creek. My people, your friends, they are the ones who deserve to face him, to pass judgment. That is the only law he understands." "And what will they do?" Ashki, she challenged, her voice rising. "Hang him from the nearest tree. That is not justice. That is vengeance. It is Merritt's way. It cannot be ours." He looked from her determined face to the broken man beneath him. Her words struck home, a painful truth. To answer Merritt's lawlessness with more lawlessness would be to lose the very thing they were fighting for. He let out a long, slow breath, and the killing rage receded. He pulled a rope from his belt and began to tie Jack's hands. They had chosen their path, the long one, the hard one. They marched Canyon Jack, bound and sullen, into the office of the United States Marshal. The man behind the desk, Abe Whitlow, was older than they had expected. His face a leathery landscape, his mustache white with age. But his eyes were clear, sharp, and missed nothing. He listened to their story without interruption, his expression skeptical. Nora laid their evidence on his desk. The coded telegrams, Merritt's ledger, the freight manifests, the melted lead seal, Elias Reed's logbook, open to the page detailing the payment for the illegal engraving. Finally, she recounted Jack's confession. Whitlow picked up the logbook, his thumb tracing the neat columns of numbers. He looked at the bound outlaw slumped in the chair. He looked at the intense Navajo warrior and the determined woman with soot on her dress. He saw the truth, a solid, undeniable thing built of paper, lead, and testimony. "Well, I will be," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "It seems you two have done my job for me." He leaned back in his chair. "This is a federal matter. The railroad, the mail, the territorial seal. I have jurisdiction. He looked them squarely in the eye. I will ride back to Dry Needle with you. We will arrest Captain Merritt and any man who stands with him. Relief washed over Nora so powerfully she felt dizzy. They had done it. But, the marshal continued, holding up a finger, a judge will want more than the word of a known outlaw and a dead engraver. The papers are good, but I want this case to be ironclad. Prescott's most powerful citizen is Marcus Thorne, the owner of the Orion silver mine. If I walk into Dry Needle with a sworn affidavit from him, testifying that Merritt's water grab is a threat to the whole territory's stability, no one will dare question the legality of my actions. It was one last hurdle, but a manageable one. They had the truth on their side, for the first time in weeks. Nora felt the fragile bloom of hope. Just then, the door opened and the local telegraph operator hurried in, a yellow envelope in his hand. "Marshal Whitlow, this just came for you, marked urgent." Whitlow tore it open, his brow furrowed as he read the clipped Morse code translation. His face went grim. He looked up, his sharp eyes finding Nora. "This message," he said, his voice heavy, "is from a woman named Ruth Caldwell in Dry Needle." He slid the paper across the desk. Nora read the words, and the hope that had just bloomed inside her withered and died, replaced by a cold, sickening dread. The message was short, a brutal punch to the gut. "Merritt has her. He took wants to trade her for the papers." The hopeful silence in Marshal Abe Whitlow's office was shattered by the rustle of the telegraph paper. Nora stared at the words, each letter a branding iron against her heart. "Merritt has her. He took The world narrowed to that single, brutal fact. Beside her, Ashki went unnaturally still. The raw emotion, the vulnerability she had seen in him on the high plateau, was gone. In its place was something colder, harder, and infinitely more dangerous. It was the stillness of a winter sky before a blizzard. "He gives us 48 hours, Whitlow said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that filled the suddenly too small room. "The papers for the girl. The exchange is to happen at the dam site." There was no debate, no discussion of the journey back. They rode from Prescott with a desperate, soul-eating urgency, the ticking clock a frantic pulse in their ears. They rode hard, sparing neither themselves nor the horses, pushing through the day and into the night. During that ride, a grim, two-pronged plan was forged in whispers against the wind. Hope of a clean legal victory had been stolen along with Shuri. Now, they would have to fight with the law and with Shadow at the same time. Marshal Whitlow, now armed with an affidavit from the Prescott mine owner and the full weight of federal authority, would ride into Dry Needle with Ruth at his side. They would not wait for Merritt's deadline. They would force a public confrontation, rally the decent folk of the town, and present the evidence in a makeshift tribunal right in the town square. They would be the public face of the law. Meanwhile, Ashki, Nora, a recovered but still pale Tom Harlan, and young Mateo would form a second, secret front. Their mission was singular: get Shea back. Tom, his deputy's badge now a symbol of renewed purpose, knew the layout of Merritt's operation. Mateo, who had spent his young life moving unseen through the margins of the town, knew every secret path, every blind spot. They were the rescue party, the ghost element in a war that had just become deeply personal. They arrived in the hills overlooking the Verde Creek as the sun set on the first day, a blood-red stain on the horizon. Below them, the dam site was a scene of frantic, ant-like activity. It was a crude, ugly thing. A temporary wall of heavy timber beams driven into the creek bed, reinforced with hundreds of sand and earth-filled sacks. The water, once a clear, life-giving stream, was now a sullen, muddy pool, rising slowly but surely behind the barrier. Armed men patrolled the perimeter, Merritt's so-called citizens' militia. Their new rifles glinting in the firelight, the air smelled of raw pine, churned mud, and the metallic tang of the captive water. The rhythmic thud of mallets driving wooden pegs into the earth was a constant, hollow heartbeat counting down their remaining time. Shuei was being held in a small tool shed set back from the main construction. 2 guards posted at the door. Ashki studied the scene for a long time, his eyes absorbing every detail: the patrol routes, the placement of the lanterns, the deep shadows cast by the piles of supplies. "There," he whispered, pointing to a small, wooden water wheel on the far side of the dam, used for powering a winch. The guards change shifts on the hour. They are lazy. They watch the road, not the rocks behind them. Nora clutched the small, polished mirror she had taken from her satchel. The plan was hers, born of her own unique skills. It was a desperate gamble. As the hour approached, Ashki melted into the darkness, moving toward the shed. Nora, with Tom and Mateo as lookouts, climbed to a rocky promontory that gave her a clear, if distant, view of the water wheel and a lone guard stationed near it. She held the mirror in her hand, her heart pounding. She had practiced the code with Ashki, a simple, repeating pattern, a distraction. She angled the mirror, catching the light from a distant campfire, and flashed a tiny, bright speck of light onto the rock face just above the guard's head. She waited a few seconds, then flashed it again. Dot, dot, dash. The letter U. You are in danger. The guard, a burly man who had been leaning against the wheel, straightened up, looking around in confusion. Nora flashed it again, higher this time. The man began to walk toward the rocks, his rifle held ready, his curiosity overriding his duty. He was drawn away from his post, toward the phantom signal. That was the opening. Ashki moved from the shadows like a wisp of smoke, a knife in his hand. He did not go for the guards at the door. He went around the back of the shed, with silent, practiced ease. He pried a loose board from the wall, creating a narrow opening. He slipped inside. Nora held her breath, her eyes glued to the shed. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Then, a board on the back wall was pushed out, and Shea was helped through the opening by her brother. She was bruised, her face smudged with dirt, but she was on her feet, her spirit unbroken. They shared a brief, fierce embrace, a silent communion of relief and love, before Ashki hurried her away into the darkness. Just as they disappeared, the guard by the water wheel gave up his search with a curse and returned to his post, none the wiser. As the rescue was underway, Marshal Whitlow and Ruth Caldwell were putting the first part of the plan into motion in Dry Needle. They set up a table in the center of the town square, under the branches of a lonely cottonwood tree. Whitlow, in his official coat, laid out the ledger and the other documents. Ruth stood beside him, a shotgun cradled in her arms. A small crowd gathered, drawn by curiosity and the sheer audacity of the act. People of Dry Needle, Whitlow's voice boomed, carrying in the still evening air. "You have been lied to, your law has been bought, and your water is being stolen." Merritt, alerted to the commotion, arrived with a dozen of his militiamen, their faces grim. He strode toward the table, a look of pure fury on his face. "This is an illegal assembly!" he roared. "Disperse at once, or you will be arrested for inciting a riot." Ruth Caldwell stepped forward, her small frame radiating an unshakable resolve. "The only riot I see, Captain, is the one you have been stirring up since you got here." She patted the stack of papers on the table. "This here is the law, and anyone who touches the law—" She looked Merritt dead in the eye, a glint of humor in her fierce gaze. "Has to deal with my pies. And I assure you, my crust is much harder to break than your nerve." A nervous laugh rippled through the crowd. The tension broke. Just for a second, Merritt's men hesitated, unsure how to handle a determined old woman armed with baked goods and a shotgun. It was then that nature rendered its own verdict. A low rumble echoed from the high country, a sound that was not thunder. The air, heavy and humid for days, had finally broken. and a torrential downpour had been unleashed on the headwaters of the Verde Creek. The runoff, channeled by the narrow canyons, was now a surging wall of water heading directly for them. At the dam site, the first sign was the sudden, alarming rise of the muddy pool. The creek, which had been lapping at the halfway point of the barrier, was now climbing with terrifying speed. The pressure mounted, and the hastily constructed dam began to groan, the timbers creaking in protest. A jet of muddy water burst through a weak spot between two sandbags. Panic erupted among Merritt's men. The flash flood, a monster born of greed and shoddy engineering, was about to devour its own creators. Ashki, Nora, and the others, having just reached the safety of the ridge, watched the disaster unfold. This was their victory. The dam would be destroyed. Merritt's plan washed away in a torrent of his own making. But as they watched, they saw that a half-dozen of the militiamen were trapped on the crumbling structure, their escape route cut off by the rising water. "Let them drown," Tom Harlan said, his voice hard. "It is what they deserve." Nora looked at the terrified men, their faces white in the firelight, and then at Ashki. She saw the same conflict in his eyes. This was the vengeance he had fought to suppress. It was being offered to him on a silver platter by the universe itself. But she also saw his sister, safe beside him. They had won the battle that mattered. "This is not our way," Ashki said, his voice quiet but firm. He turned to his sister. "Go with Tom and Mateo. Get to high ground." He then looked at Nora. "We have to release the pressure, now, before the whole thing breaks apart at once." It was an insane choice, a moral imperative that defied all logic. They ran toward the chaos, toward the very men who had been their enemies moments before. Ashki shouted instructions, his voice cutting through the panic. He pointed to a secondary spillway, a runoff channel that had been dug but not completed. "We have to open that channel," he yelled. "It will divert the worst of it." They worked with a desperate fury. Nora and Ashki side by side with some of the militiamen who had scrambled to safer ground. They used shovels, pickaxes, and their bare hands, tearing at the earth, creating an escape route for the raging water. Ashki, with a strength born of desperation, single-handedly rolled a massive boulder out of the path. On the dam itself, the trapped men were clinging to the timbers as the structure shuddered beneath them. One man lost his footing and was swept into the churning water. Without a thought, Ashki grabbed a rope, tied it around his waist, and had Nora and another man anchor him as he plunged into the torrent, pulling the sputtering guard to safety. He was saving the lives of men who had a bounty on his head. Amid the chaos, Canyon Jack, who had been brought to the site by Merritt and was being held under loose guard, saw his chance. He scrambled onto a makeshift raft of loose timbers and pushed off into the current, hoping to be washed to freedom. But Tom Harlan, seeing the move, was on him in an instant, wading into the shallows and dragging the raft, with Jack on it, back to shore. Jack looked from Tom to Ashki, who was now helping a second terrified man from the failing dam. Why, Jack yelled over the roar of the water, his voice full of disbelief. "Why are you saving them?" Ashki looked at him, his face streaked with mud, the water swirling around his knees. "Water does not choose sides," he said. The spillway was open. A great torrent of water burst through, easing the pressure on the main dam. The structure held, groaning and shuddering, but it held. They had done it. They had averted the worst of the disaster, saving the valley below from a catastrophic flood, and saving the lives of their enemies in the process. Captain Silas Merritt stood on the highest point of the dam, a lone figure against the raging water. His hostage was gone. His plan was in ruins. His own men were being rescued by the very people he had sought to crush. He was a king in a kingdom of mud and splintered wood. He raised his pistol, his face a mask of insane fury. He aimed it not at any one person, but at the world that had defied him. In the deafening roar of the water, he pulled the trigger. A single shot rang out, a sharp angry crack that was almost lost in the storm. Merritt's gunshot was the breaking point, a crack of human madness against the overwhelming roar of nature. It was not aimed at anyone. It was a futile scream of rage at his own ruin. The sound, however, broke the spell of stunned disbelief that had gripped his remaining loyal men. They saw their leader cornered, their project collapsing, and they reacted as cornered men do. They raised their rifles and opened fire. The next moments were a blur of desperate, instinctual action. There was no time for strategy, only for survival. Ashki tackled Nora, pulling her behind the solid granite of a large boulder as bullets spanged off the rock above their heads. Tom Harlan, his face pale but his hands steady, returned fire from the cover of an overturned supply wagon. His shots carefully aimed, meant to suppress, not to kill. Marshal Abe Whitlow, his face a grim mask of determination, took cover beside him. The fight was not a grand battle. It was a messy, terrifying scramble in the mud and the driving spray from the broken dam. Ammunition was precious. Every shot had to count. "Nora!" "The spare cartridges," Tom yelled, his pistol clicking empty. Without hesitation, Nora crawled through the mud, the ledger and papers still tucked inside her shirt, a hard, rectangular shield against her ribs. She reached Tom's side and began reloading his pistol and rifle with swift, practiced motions, her fingers never fumbling. The woman who had once been terrified of a firearm was now a vital part of the fight, a calm center in the storm of chaos. Amid the crack of gunfire and the roar of the water, Marshal Whitlow's voice boomed out. "A force of law against the lawlessness," he shouted in bursts, his words punctuated by the gunshots. "In the name of the laws of the United States and the territory of Arizona," he bellowed, crouching behind the wagon wheel, "I command you to lay down your arms, Captain Silas Merritt. You are under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and the attempted murder of a federal deputy." His words were answered by another volley of shots. But the proclamation had an effect. Some of Merritt's men, the hired miners and prospectors who had signed on for a paycheck, not a war, began to waver. They were not fighting for a cause. They were fighting for a man who was clearly undone. While Tom and the marshal pinned the men down, Ashki saw his opening. He moved, not toward the shooters, but toward the dam, toward Merritt. He ran in a low crouch, using the piles of earth and splintered timbers as cover, a ghost moving through the mayhem. He had to end this at the source. He found Merritt standing on the highest, most unstable point of the crumbling barrier, the muddy water swirling around his polished boots. The man's uniform was soaked and stained, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He still held his pistol, but it was pointed at the water, at his failed dream. Ashki stopped a few feet from him. The roar of the flood, a wall of sound around them. There was no point in shouting. He simply stood there, solid and unmovable, his presence a final judgment. Merritt turned, his eyes wild. "They were insects," Merritt screamed, his voice thin against the torrent. "All of them. I was bringing order, taming this wasteland." Ashki looked at the man, and for the first time, he felt not rage, but a profound pity. He saw a man so hollowed out by greed that he could not see the life all around him. "The thing you wanted to chain," Ashki said, his voice low but carrying with an incredible clarity, "was never just water." As he spoke, the section of the dam where Merritt stood gave a final, shuddering groan. The earth and sandbags beneath his feet, saturated and undermined by the very water he had tried to imprison, simply dissolved. Merritt's eyes widened in a moment of pure, animal terror. He flailed his arms, trying to find a footing that was no longer there. He did not fall because he was pushed. He fell because the foundation of his own greed crumbled beneath him. With a final, choked cry, he was swept into the torrent, a victim of his own creation. With Merritt gone, the will to fight evaporated from his men. They threw down their guns, their hands raised in surrender. The battle was over. But the struggle with the water was not. Working together, the townspeople, the Navajo, and even Merritt's surrendered men spent the next hour shoring up the spillway, guiding the floodwaters back into the main channel. They were no longer enemies. They were simply people working against a common disaster. The sight was both terrible and beautiful. The raw power of the water was a destructive force, but in its release, there was a sense of cleansing, of nature reclaiming its rightful course. The next day, under a sky washed clean by the storm, the town of Dry Needle gathered once more in the square. This time, there was no fear, no simmering hostility. There was only a quiet, sober sense of awe. Marshal Whitlow stood before them, with Tom Harlan at his side, his deputy's badge now polished and worn with pride. Nora stepped forward. The ledger and the papers were in her hands. Her dress was still damp and muddy at the hem, a testament to the battle she had fought. She was no longer just a telegraph operator, a keeper of other people's words. She was a keeper of the truth, with a clear, steady voice. She read from Merritt's own ledger, her words weaving a damning narrative of corporate greed and corruption. She presented the forged seal, the telegrams, the manifests. It was all there, an undeniable chain of evidence. When she finished, Marshal Whitlow brought a sullen, defeated Kenyan Jack forward. Jack listened to the evidence, then looked at Ashki, who stood with his sister and grandmother at the edge of the crowd. He saw no triumph in the Navajo's face, only a quiet, weary resolve, with a sigh that seemed to empty him of all his bitterness. Jack took the pen Whitlow offered and signed a full confession. A sound started at the back of the crowd, a smattering of applause that grew into a wave of thunderous, heartfelt relief. It was the sound of a town taking its first breath of free air after being suffocated for so long. One of the ranchers who had been most vocal in his accusations against the Navajo made his way through the crowd to Ashki. The man was humbled, his face full of a shame that was honest and deep. "I was wrong," the rancher said, extending a hand. "We were afraid, and he used that against us. I am sorry." Ashki looked at the man's outstretched hand, and then at his grandmother. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. He took the rancher's hand and shook it. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. In that moment, Ashki felt the last vestiges of his brother's anger, the hot-blooded need for vengeance, finally cool and recede. He had not won by crushing his enemy. He had won by choosing to build something better in its place. He had chosen the long, hard path, and it had led him here. As the crowd began to disperse, a damp breeze rustled the leaves of the cottonwood tree. It caught the dark blue neckerchief tied around Ashki's throat, the one with Nora's copper stitches glinting in the sun, and made it flutter like a proud, resilient banner. Nora looked down at the creek, which was now flowing freely within its banks, along the water's edge. She saw the first tiny, green buds appearing on the branches of the cottonwoods, a promise of new life. That evening, a great bonfire was lit in the town square. It was not a fire of anger or fear, but of celebration and community. The people of Dry Needle and the people from Ashki's camp gathered together, sharing food and stories. The air was filled with a cautious but genuine warmth. Mateo, his face glowing in the firelight, pulled a small harmonica from his pocket and began to play a simple, sweet, and hopeful tune. Chie, sitting beside her brother, watched Nora talking with the marshal. A genuine, unguarded smile touched her lips for the first time since her ordeal. She was safe. Her brother was safe. Their water was safe. Ruth Caldwell moved through the crowd, handing out thick slices of apple pie from a large tray. She stopped in front of Nora and Ashki, offering them a piece. "Well," she said, her eyes twinkling with her usual wry humor, "what did I tell you? The pies of justice always rise better after a storm." The dawn that followed the bonfire was quiet and clean. The air, washed by the storm, felt new. Marshal Abe Whitlow, His work in dry needle done, organized his prisoners. A sullen, silent line of Merritt's former militia. Their dreams of a quick payday turned to dust, were loaded into a wagon for the long ride to the territorial prison. Merritt's body had been recovered downstream, a final, sodden punctuation mark on his reign of greed. The Elkhorn Water and Railroad Company, faced with a federal investigation and a mountain of damning evidence, would be tied up in legal battles for years to come. In the weeks that followed, Dry Needle began to heal, not by forgetting, but by actively rebuilding. The most remarkable change happened at the creek. Led by Ashke's quiet wisdom and Nora's clear-headed sense of fairness, the ranchers and the Navajo elders sat down together. They did not sit as adversaries, but as neighbors who had looked into the same abyss and chosen to pull back together. They drew up a new water compact, a simple document that guaranteed shared access, outlined responsibilities for maintaining the waterway, and established a council with members from both the town and the Navajo community to resolve any future disputes. It was a piece of paper born not of lawyers and distant politicians, but of shared hardship and mutual respect. The town's official leadership changed as well. The territorial governor, prompted by Marshal Whitlow's scathing report, offered the position of town sheriff to Tom Harlan. He tried to refuse, claiming he was not the right man for the job, that he lacked the necessary steel. It was Ruth Caldwell who changed his mind. She found him polishing the brass on the door of the now empty sheriff's office. "Tom," she said, "setting a fresh pie on the windowsill. The strongest steel is not the kind that never bends. It is the kind that bends in a storm and does not break. This town does not need another iron fist. It needs a steady hand. It needs your hand." He accepted the job the next day. Ruth's own establishment blossomed. A new, hand-painted sign appeared above the door of her boarding house. It read, "Caldwell's Boarding House. Fine food, fair lodging, and sound legal advice. Pies a specialty." Her business thrived, becoming the true heart of the town, a place where disputes were settled over coffee and common sense before they had a chance to fester. Young Mateo, his days of scavenging for scrap metal behind him, found a new future. The town blacksmith, a man who had seen the boy's quick mind and nimble fingers, took him on as an apprentice, the sound of his hammer striking anvil, once just a part of the town's noise, now rang with the clear, bright sound of a life being forged anew. But the most hopeful new beginning took place in the shade of the great cottonwood tree down by the creek. Here, Nora and Ashke started their school. It had no building, just a collection of smooth, flat stones for seats and a slate propped against the tree's trunk. In the mornings, Nora taught the Navajo children and a few of the town's youngsters how to form their letters, how to read words, and how to tap out messages on a practice telegraph key. Her teaching was patient and full of a joy she had never known. She was not just transmitting information, she was giving them a voice in the wider world. In the afternoons, it was Ashke's turn. He did not use a slate. His classroom was the earth, the sky, and the water. He taught the children how to read the stories written in the tracks of a deer, how to find their way by the stars, how to listen to the language of the flowing water, and how to care for the horses that were the lifeblood of his people. He was not just teaching skills, he was passing on a legacy of resilience and a deep, abiding connection to the land. One late afternoon, after the children had all gone home, Nora and Ashke stood together by the water's edge. The creek flowed past them, its voice a gentle, constant murmur. The sun was low, casting a warm, golden light across the landscape. Ashke reached up and touched the mended neckerchief at his throat. The wound beneath it had healed into a thin, pale scar. "The stitches are holding," Nora said softly, a small smile playing on her lips. He looked at her, his dark eyes full of a deep, quiet warmth that made her heart feel as if it were glowing. He gently touched the scar on his neck, his fingers tracing its path. "Do you still think?" she asked, her voice a playful whisper, picking up the thread of a conversation that had changed everything between them. that you are falling before heaven or before me?" A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, a rare and beautiful sight. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, a perfect and familiar fit. "Both," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "But you are the one who helps me stand up." He did not need to say more. Their love was not a thing of grand pronouncements. It was a quiet, sturdy structure they had built together. One small, repeated act of trust and courage at a time. It was the choice, made every day, to stand together. Freedom, they had both learned, was not about being untethered. It was about knowing, deep in your soul, where you belonged. The telegraph in Dry Needle was busy now, but the messages Nora translated were no longer coded threats or corporate commands. They were orders for new seed, messages between separated families. News of a good harvest to the north. The instrument of power had become a tool of community, its metallic clicks weaving a new story of connection and hope. The seasons began to turn. The green buds on the cottonwoods opened into broad leaves, which in turn faded to the color of the autumn sun. The hogan Ashki had dreamed of for his sister was now built, a sturdy, warm home filled with the scent of her herbs and the sound of her quiet humming. One morning, just as the first light of dawn was spilling over the mesas, painting the surface of the Verde Creek in strokes of rose and gold, Nora and Ashki stood outside their own small cabin, built a little ways downstream from the town. A letter had arrived for them the day before, bearing a seal from Washington. It was a formal request for them to travel east, to testify before a congressional committee in the government's case against the Elkhorn Company. A new journey, a new fight, was calling to them. But that was a decision for another day. This morning, there was only the peaceful sound of the flowing water and the warmth of the rising sun. Ashki's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining. From the corral nearby came the sound of children's laughter, clear and bright on the crisp morning air, as Mateo showed Xia Ye's young cousins how to properly brush a horse. This was their home. This was their peace. Whatever came next, they would face it from here, together. Thank you for being part of our story tonight. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from so we can all connect. And remember to subscribe to Wild West Tales, like the video, and press the hype button to help share this tale with more people.